Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this channel I will be teaching physics, chemistry and mathematics starting from 8th standard till 12th standard. If you are finding difficulty in learning physics, chemistry and mathematics, then please subscribe to my channel and you can enjoy learning physics, chemistry and mathematics. Please do subscribe to my channel. In my last video, actually I was discussing the 9th chapter of 8th standard science subject, which is friction. So in this particular video, I will be explaining the answers present in this friction chapter. Coming to the first question in this particular exercise, we have fill in the blanks. In that, first question states that friction opposes dash to the objects. So it actually restricts the motion of two objects on each other. So answer for the first question in this particular fill in the blanks is motion. So coming to the second question in this fill in the blanks, friction depends on dash of the surfaces. So here actually friction depends on the irregularities of surfaces. So if the irregularities on the surface is more, then the friction will be more. If the irregularities on the surface is very less, then friction will be very less. So that's why friction is actually dependent on the irregularities of the surface. Hence the answer for this second question in the fill in the blanks is irregularities of surface. Coming to the third question, friction actually produces heat because when two objects come into contact, there will be a lot of frictional force coming into the picture. So that frictional force actually generates lot of heat in between these two objects. So answer for third question is heat. Sprinkling powder on carom board reduces friction. The powder molecules will actually go and deposit in the irregularities of the board and hence making the board more and more smoother. Hence when board becomes more and more smoother, friction reduces and you can easily hit the pawn present on that particular board. Hence the answer for fourth question in this fill in the blanks is reduces. Sliding friction is dash than static friction. What do you mean by static friction? Is that when two particular objects are at rest, the frictional force which is generated between these two objects is actually known as static friction. Why? Because this object and this object are in rest. So if you consider sliding motion, then one particular object will be sliding on the other particular object. So when this particular object is actually sliding on other object, the friction which is developed in between these two objects is actually known as sliding friction. Already this object is in motion with a particular speed. Hence the frictional force actually reduces because whenever the interlocking of irregularities happens in between the object, it is actually broken by the speed at which that particular object is actually traveling. Hence the sliding friction will be less than the static friction because when the object is at rest, the irregularities of one particular object will lock with the irregularities of other object. But when this object is moving on that particular object, the irregularities will be constantly breaking in between. Hence the frictional force will be less than the static friction. So answer for this fifth question is less. So the question is, they have given three kinds of friction and they have told to arrange these three frictions in decreasing order. So those three frictions are static friction, sliding friction and rolling friction. We all know that when two objects are at rest and lying on each other, and the friction which is developed in between those two objects is actually static friction, which will be higher. So coming to the sliding friction, when object is actually sliding on another object, the irregularities present in between those two objects will go on breaking every instant of time when that object moves on that particular object. So that actually reduces the static friction. Hence sliding friction is lesser than static friction and rolling friction will reduce lot of friction. Hence moving object from one place to other place will be much more easier. Hence if you want to write these three frictions in decreasing order, then static friction comes in first place, sliding friction comes next and rolling friction comes next. So the correct option for this second question is option C. Coming to the third question, a child is actually running her toy car on wet marble. She is also running the same toy car on dry marble, on towel and on newspaper. So now we have to write the friction applied by these floors in an increasing order. So now wet floor applies very less amount of friction, hence wet floor comes first. Then dry floor applies much more higher friction than wet floor, hence dry comes next. Newspaper applies more friction than dry floor, hence newspaper comes in the third place. And at last, towel applies maximum amount of friction compared to wet floor, dry floor and newspaper, hence towel comes at last. So if you want to write frictional force in increasing order on these particular surfaces, then wet comes first, dry comes next, newspaper and towel. So this is actually increasing order. So the correct option for this third question is option A. Coming to the fourth question in this particular exercise, if you keep a book on a particular table and if this table is slightly slanted and if this book actually starts sliding on this particular table, then we have to tell in which direction the frictional force is actually applied. The frictional force actually restricts the sliding motion of this particular object. Hence, the frictional force applied on this particular object will be in this particular direction, and the frictional force applied by the book on this particular table will be in this direction. If you consider the frictional force acting by the table on book, then that will be in this particular direction. It all depends on which object you are actually choosing to decide the friction. So coming to the fifth question, they have asked, accidentally if you spill soapy water on the floor, then walking on that floor will be easier or difficult. Actually, walking on that particular floor which has soapy water spilled on it will be much more difficult. Why? Because the irregularities which was there on the floor was providing necessary amount of frictional force for us to walk on that particular floor. Now because we have spilled soapy water on that particular floor, it actually covers up those irregularities and reduces the friction which that floor was giving for us to walk. So now walking will be much more difficult on this particular floor which has soapy water spilled on it. So all these things you can explain in your own words for fifth question. Coming to sixth question, why sportsmen actually use shoes which has spikes over it? Because sportsmen will be running on the ground and they want necessary amount of friction to support their running. Because while running they should not skid on the ground so that they can get injured. To avoid difficulty while running, they use shoes with spikes which can give maximum friction for their shoes, because when they have spikes on that particular shoes, it actually gives more amount of friction for that particular shoes to have a hold on the ground. Hence, to get more friction, sports person actually use shoes which has more spikes on it. So coming to the seventh question, there are two students named Iqbal and Seema. Iqbal is actually moving a lighter object on the floor and Seema is actually moving heavier object on the floor. Who will apply larger force to move on the same floor? Actually, Seema has to apply larger force to move the object on the floor. Why? Because the object is already having lot of mass in it. Hence, it creates more difficulty to overcome the friction. Hence, Seema has to apply more force to overcome that particular friction to move the heavier object on the floor. Because of the mass of that particular object, there will be much more higher locking in between the irregularities between those two objects. Hence, there will be larger amount of friction applied by the same force on heavier objects. Hence, Seema has to put more force to move that object in a particular direction. Coming to the eighth question, why sliding friction is less than static friction? So as I explained before, static friction is actually generated in between two objects which are at rest. So if you keep an object on a particular floor and this object is at rest, then the friction which is generated in between these two objects is actually known as static friction. And if this particular object is actually sliding on the floor, then the friction which is applied by this floor on this particular object is actually sliding friction. When this object is moving with a particular speed u, then the irregularities which was there on this particular object and the irregularities which was there on this floor is actually disturbed, because the speed at which the object is actually moving on this particular floor is actually responsible for the disturbance between the locking of this particular irregularities. Because of this particular disturbance, the friction applied between these two objects will be lesser. Hence, the sliding friction will be less than static friction. Why? Because when the object is moving at a particular speed, it will constantly break the lock in between the irregularities of these two surfaces. Hence the sliding friction is less than static friction. So that is the answer for this 8th question. So you can write the answers in your own words. Coming to the 9th question, you have to give examples where friction acts as friend and in some cases where friction acts as an enemy. So while walking, while doing various other activities in our day-to-day life, actually friction is helping us to do our work. But in so many other cases, when we move a heavy object, when we actually walk inside swimming pool, actually friction is acting as an enemy to us. So in some cases friction is actually friend for us, and in some cases friction is actually enemy for us. So you can see around you and you can go on listing examples where friction is actually becoming your friend and where actually friction is becoming your enemy. So coming to the 10th question, why objects moving in liquid should have certain necessary shape so that that object can easily move in that particular liquid. The front part of ship or boat will have a sharp edge, because when the front part of this particular boat or ship is very sharp, when they are actually traveling inside the liquid, they actually reduce the friction which is applied by these particular water molecules, because the sharp edge of this particular boat or ship is actually breaking through the water molecules and they actually progress forward. Hence, if the edges of that particular ship or that particular boat is very sharp, then that can easily break through those water molecules and they can easily reduce the friction which is applied by the water molecules and they can easily travel further. Hence, necessary shape for the ship or boat traveling inside liquids is very much important so that they can easily overcome the friction which is applied by that particular water molecules. So now I have explained answers for all 10 questions. Now you have to write these answers in your own words and you can execute the same answers in your exam as well. So this is all there in this particular video. Like this, I will be uploading more and more videos related to physics, chemistry and mathematics starting from 8th standard till 12th standard. Please subscribe to my channel and stay tuned with my channel to learn physics, chemistry and mathematics. Thank you.